The clouds are rolling in. I hope it's going to rain because the pond is drying up. If you're worried about all the critters that live in the pond, don't worry too much. Around the corner there's a big lake where they can all go to get away from the drought. These are drought conditions all across North America. Today's two big questions. When we play video games, are we experiencing something akin to religion? And is there something like ritual magic in social media, specifically Instagram? In their work, I Play, Therefore I Believe, Religion and Faith in Digital Games, Vincenzo Casson and Mattia Thibault, I know I pronounced their names incorrectly, they argue that the answer is yes. In video games, we experience something like religion. Quote, the presence of religion in games, however, should be considered only as part of a deeper and more complex process in which the experience of religion and its cultural messages interact with technological and social innovation, end quote. So the authors say, yes, in experiencing digital video games, we do experience something like religion. They want to look at the relationship between belief and disbelief, and faith and trust, and they ask us to conceive of really two terms that are really important. They want us to conceive of what it means for a suspension of belief, and what does institutional belief. What do these things mean? How might they relate to video games and religion? And we need to be careful about the word religion because we need to unpack what that might mean. In this case, they prefer to use the term religio, and they give it a specific definition. They use the word religio to describe, quote, feelings and anthropological needs and customs that precede actual religions, end quote. So they're pushing us away from this idea of institutionalized religion per se, and they want us to think about, well, how does it feel? What are some of the needs? What are the underlying subjective realities of religion, rather than sort of the outside architectural, factual, institutional religions? What's going on in religion? How do people feel? How does that work? And what's going on in digital video games? How does that feel? How does that work? There are two big reasons why monotheism specifically factors heavily, or Abrahamic religions, factor heavily into our discussion of video games. The first is that Western culture is heavily Abrahamic in tone, culture, history. So monotheism is everywhere, and of course Western culture is largely responsible for the creation of video games. But the other reason that follows very closely on the first reason is that transcendence figures heavily in monotheism. This idea of God is holy or separate. We'll go back to this topic in a second. But that experience, so they want to analyze that particular experience in video games. This is a huge philosophical topic. What does it mean to play? What does it mean to engage in something? Whether you're experiencing work of art, poetry, or whether you're playing basketball, or whether you're playing a video game. This idea of play, it's like a dance in German Spiel, where we enter into an experience where we give ourselves over to that experience. We follow its rules, we follow the expected customs and the norms of whatever we're doing. You can't play basketball and play by the rules of chess. That wouldn't work, and it doesn't make any sense. And if you read poetry like you're reading a scientific textbook, that doesn't really work either. That doesn't make sense. So when we play video games, the authors want us to think about what does it mean to really play, the process or the experience. And one of the big things about play is that we have to suspend our belief. That is, we enter into a fictional world. Typically it's a fictional world, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or, in my case, Subnautica with my sons, where we have to accept that the impossible is somehow possible, at least tentatively. So whether it's Fortnite or another game that you're playing, you believe that what is happening in the story is at least conceivable in that story. You're drawing a line between the real world that you know follows certain physical rules and this fictional world of the video game. We know this intuitively. We experience this when we play video games. We leave the ordinary for the extraordinary. We leave the normal for the virtual. And in the virtual, we're exposed to new worlds, new narratives, new stories that don't make sense often, that are so incredible that they require us to think of them as possible even though we know they're not. That's a weird way of thinking, that I know this can't be true, but I must accept it at least provisionally in order for me to truly play. The authors don't talk about this too much, but there's also this idea of fair play. That is, the more I give myself over to the game, believing in the narrative of the game, believing in the truth of the game, the more successful my experience is, and the more real, of course, the game becomes. And the more I resist it and try and find alternatives that the narrators didn't design, that didn't put into the game, the less fair it becomes. And in many ways, I might be able to go out and get cheat codes. This is pretty popular, right? People get tired of following the narrative of the game, so they get out cheat codes and they get God mode. That's not fair play, and that in some respects really diminishes that belief system that we're going to be talking about. All right, so let's say provisionally we've accepted the craziness of this video game, and we're going to play this video game, and we're going to accept that there are gods, and there's magic, and there are superpowers. Okay, fine. To play a game, we must somehow believe in the game. Well, this isn't an extraordinary claim, but it's an interesting claim. But then the authors go on and they want to talk about institutional belief. Institutional belief, and that sounds dry, but it's an important concept. Here it is. Institutional belief, quote, can be observed in the traditional role of ancient myths and epic poems, in folk tales and children's stories, in historical novels, and above all, in institutionalized religions and their profession declaration of faith, end quote. So institutional belief is that set of assumptions or ideas that we must surrender to in order for this thing to exist. The video game cannot exist unless we surrender to these institutional beliefs. In monotheistic religion, institutional belief takes the form of creeds, theologies, histories, codified documents of all sorts. And it's this thing that makes up the religion. So there's the practice of religion, but this thing that makes up the belief structure. It's fairly easily agreed to or rejected when you can see it on paper. Sometimes it's implicit and it's not obvious, but there's a belief structure there. There are norms that, while not always made explicit, there are norms there of belief. So the authors are claiming that video games and religion share in a belief system, institutional beliefs, norms, rules, boundaries, guidelines, creeds. Well, that's not outrageous. That's a fine claim, I guess. Quote, in order to play, the players must give themselves to the game, have faith in it, trust it, and accepting what it offers. In this way, the digital game replicates the dynamics that are typical of the processes of religio, that is, religio, the respect and adherence to a series of norms embedded in traditions, beliefs, and rituals, end quote. But this isn't as benign as it might initially seem. For when we're creating new rules, new belief systems, we're creating new worldviews, new ways of interpreting existence, what is good, judging right from wrong, what has value and what doesn't. In other words, this formulation of belief, institutional belief specifically, is creating a worldview through which you see the world, yourself and others. And there's a bit of a snowball effect here. The authors argue that once we have these new belief systems based in a gaming narrative, that belief system moves through trust because we begin to trust more and more because we want to play the game more and more. You have to trust more and more as you're going in. You can't just suspend trust in the video game, otherwise it would fall apart. You wouldn't be playing fairly at that point. You move then into actual systems of faith. From belief, encouraged by the sense of trust, I believe in the truth of the game, the meaning of the game, the judgment of the game. I want to achieve a high score or something. I want to be successful and finish this game. Into faith. What does that mean? That's an open question, but that's where they're going. They're trying to get this idea from us that, like religion, that requires some kind of belief in the unseen, we have to have this trust as a belief in the unseen with video games as well. So how in the world do we arrive at this idea of faith based in video games? Aren't video games this obvious secular humanist thing? Why must we have some sense of faith? And the authors tie this to the idea of transcendence. Transcendence, traditionally speaking, is this idea, and it's at the sort of the polar opposite end of what we would call immanence. Transcendence is that God is separate from creation. God is holy. God is so much more than creation. If God was here standing beside me, like a person, like a thing, like a created being, God would have slidden across that spectrum or slidden down that ladder of being, and God would be immanent. Instead, monotheism emphasizes God's transcendence. Likewise, we see this in video games, the authors argue, that there's an incredible imbalance between the player's ability to negotiate rules, the player's ability to determine fate. The player simply follows the rules, in most video games at least. You enter in, you sign up, you become a player, you don't get to decide anything. The architecture of the game, the story, the narrative, the point of the game is pre-designed, predetermined. Likewise, with monotheism, a transcendent God knows the future, he knows the past, or she knows, or it knows the future and the past. Everything's predestined, and nothing can actually change the future, the ultimate future. God is in complete control. In this case, it's not necessarily God per se, but video game programmers or the people, the company that's designed, this is the way the video game is going to unfold. Admittedly, this is just one form of transcendence, and this is kind of coming across as a totalitarianism of sorts, which is not a very inviting form of transcendence. But it boils down to this. You want to play the game, you submit to something that you really don't have any control over. You want to be a part of this religion, submit to the divine, you really don't have any control over how life ultimately pans out. You have control over whether or not you play. You have control over how well you play and the strategies you take and make in life or in the game. You have choice over that, but ultimately, transcendence rules. So you want to play a video game. All right, well, you're going to be introduced to new beliefs that you're going to be expected to play and to play fairly. You're going to have to give yourself over in some way. The mechanism the authors use, the term for that mechanism the authors use is suspension of belief, a suspension of belief. So you know Harry Potter can't really cast spells, but you want to play this video game in which you get to cast spells. So there's a suspension or there's a sustained doubt. You don't just push off what you know to be untrue, you just welcome it in a little bit. You begin to believe these new things. Soon you'll have new institutional beliefs, new norms are created, new ways of judging and perceiving the world inside the virtual are created. Now you haven't left the real world, you're still you, but there's this growing new virtual world that you're participating in, trying to participate in fairly, fully. That will move then into trust, where we begin to trust the game a little bit more. We become more familiar with how the narration works, the characters work, the tools at our disposal, we know how those work. And then soon we'll have a new belief system driven largely by this notion of transcendence, where we've given ourselves over more and more and more to a new religio. It just so happens that that religio is a digital video game. Now, the authors are mindful of the fact that there's a danger in presenting both religio or religion and digital video games in this way, that it can err on the side of sounding very totalitarian. That is, that if you want to believe, you need to stop being a critical thinker. You need to stop being a questioner of the world around you. And they don't want to go that far. In fact, they argue that the opposite may actually be the case, that digital video games, maybe religio too, can help us be more critical thinkers. There's a simultaneous movement now between subjecting ourselves to fair play, but also coming across an entirely new set of questions and curiosities in these new virtual worlds. Questions and curiosities that we may not have even perceived before we entered into these new worlds. That is, to be religious doesn't just narrow how you perceive the world, maybe it opens it up in many different important ways. Quote, that digital games can be an extremely productive tool to help players develop a critical spirit, and not necessarily only within the religious context. Questioning what we are told and wondering about the environment surrounding us are very important skills in a world where falsity and deception are made particularly easy by new technologies. Digital games could, and maybe should, also be used to this end. End quote. So the authors are basically arguing that while there's a suspension of doubt, a suspension of disbelief initially to get into a video game, to get into religion, that's not a totalitarian thing, that's not a full thing. Once we're in these new virtual worlds, these new digital realities in religion, new questions emerge that we may not have had before. New realities of doubt can emerge that we didn't have before because of these new worlds. So back to the original title of the paper, I play, therefore I believe. Indeed, there do seem to be some similarities now between religio, faith, belief, and trust. A similar matrix that we would find in religion is found in digital video games. Are they the same? Of course not, but they share a lot of very interesting parallels. In her work, Ritual Magic and User-Generated Deities on Instagram, Rose Rawson asks us to think about whether or not there might be ritual magic practices in social media platforms. And her answer is yes, we can find magic in places like Instagram. Magic. Okay, well, we've talked a little bit about magic before. What does she mean by magic? So what is magic? Well, quoting another author, Malinowski, Rawson says the following, or believes the following. The function of magic is to ritualize man's optimism, to enhance his faith in the victory of hope over fear. Magic expresses the greater value for man of confidence over doubt, of steadfastness over vacillation, of optimism over pessimism, end quote. So what is magic? Rawson's take is that magic is basically a self-defense or a protection against an otherwise hostile world, virtual world or real world. We live in a helpless state when we're online. We're always afraid of hackers, computer crashes, viruses, all these different things. And one of the platforms, or one of the ways that we can sort of defend ourselves on these platforms, she argues, is through magic ritual. Rawson's definition of magic has a lot to do with what's called the psychological criticism of religion. And the psychological criticism says basically this. It is a criticism. It's saying that people create religions or they create gods as a means of self-protection. So these would be fictional things. So in the case of Freud, he would say that we have these illusions about the divine that make us feel good, father-like figure that protects us, that's watching over us. Nietzsche would say, of course, it's just pure delusion, that there's in fact nothing there at all, and it's kind of unhelpful to even have these sorts of deities running around, but that's a whole different story. In the case of the online virtual world, Safety Kitty. Rawson's going to point out that Safety Kitty is an example of the creation of a virtual deity or a virtual magic to protect users from hackers, spam, all kinds of maybe even computer crashes. We need these magic rituals to protect us. So this is Safety Kitty. Safety Kitty exists on Instagram. Probably the Safety Kitty won't help you with hardware crashes, but it's supposed to ward off bad things in general. So, quote, this is Safety Kitty. If you repost Safety Kitty, you're safe from all chain mail and scary posts, end quote. Okay, would anybody seriously do something like repost this? You're not supposed to be reposting on Instagram. You're supposed to be doing original content, but would really anybody be gullible enough to believe that by reposting this? And the answer would be yes. Many people apparently believe that by reposting this, they're protected. So what's going on here? How does this mechanism work? Do they believe that they're going to be protected, that there's a fact claim here that's justifiable? Or, as Rawson will argue, are people who are reposting this largely just acting out of fear, not necessarily reason? People acting out of fear as the basis for this particular form of ritual magic, not reason. Rawson wants to show, quote, how community-decreed magical practices deviate from the platform-specific functionality of Instagram, instead relying on rituals that require greater exertion of effort or that are nonsensical within the historical and technological infrastructure of the network, end quote. Okay, so there's a lot here. Basically, people who are reposting Safety Kitty to protect themselves from images, ideas, hackers, whatever, are doing it in a way that's outside of Instagram's rules and policies. So they're breaking the rules. They're going outside the boundaries. Okay. But they're also doing something that doesn't jive or doesn't work. It's nonsensical, as she says, within the social and technological infrastructure of the network. You know that by reposting it, that shouldn't really be stopping anything. That's kind of a normative or a common sense view. It's not going to work. So then why do it? We do it because, in a sense, it does work. It offers us a sense of community. It offers us a sense of reprieve from the fear. It's doing a number of very positive things, actually. You don't need to post the image. You can also do a hashtag, #SafetyKitty. This becomes a symbol. And what's interesting about symbols is that they encompass or they embody a worldview, a belief system. So instead of just being a sign that's straightforward, a stop sign as an example, it's just straightforward stop. Symbols can have a lot of rich meaning inside of them, packed inside. And Rawson is arguing that inside the symbol, the hashtag #SafetyKitty, is a symbol for safety, protection, community. Whether people recognize it as magical or not, it's performing that magical ritual, that feeling of being safe because of something outside of you more powerful than you. Safety Kitty. Let me quote from Rawson. This is an important passage. Quote, magic is dependent upon collective belief in the influence of repeated actions. Say that again. Magic is dependent upon collective belief in the influence of repeated actions, rather than fleeting amazement or bewilderment at the causal power of mechanical processes. So Rawson is basically taking issue with the kind of ideology that I've been kind of falling into the last couple of videos, which is saying that magic is associated with wonder and awe, and those are connected directly with the bewilderment and the complexity of technology itself. Isn't this amazing to see how computers can do what they do, and it doesn't make sense, and we don't understand how they work, so it's like magic. And she's saying, well, step back from looking at technology and saying there's a sort of an Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently complex technologies like magic, right? So step back from that kind of ideology, a way of thinking about it, and ask, are there ritual practices in social media? And she answers yes. And we can see this idea of protection and community development and building, the repeated practices that don't make sense in the larger context of technology. These things are happening right now on Instagram in the form of Safety Kitty and other things. I'll admit the first time I read Rawson's work, I was kind of put off a little bit. I thought it was a bit trite, a bit silly. Safety kitty, really, is that an indication of ritual magic practice online? And after I finished reading her work and I did a little bit more research into social media, you probably will have guessed this already, but there are a lot of issues having to do with image, bullying, anxiety, just self-esteem in general. Because of these social media platforms, a lot of people are suffering mental health issues. So here's just one point of reference. There are many others that you could be looking at, but here's one. From 2017, the UK's Royal Society for Public Health looked at basically 1,500 people and asked them, ages 14 to 24, how would you rank the social media platforms in terms of things like body image, bullying, depression, emotional support? How do you feel after using these online platforms? The ranking from good to bad, so good to bad, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, and the worst offender, Instagram. So this raises a couple of things for me. On the one hand, I can understand why Safety Kitty would be attractive to some people. If you're feeling like you are compelled to use these online platforms and you feel terrible about yourself after you see all these images about people's lives and how other people look and you don't fit that cat, I can understand wanting to reach out for some kind of protection. So thank you, Rawson, for drawing my attention to that. But of course, this raises the question of, are magic rituals enough? No, they're not. We need more. We need more safeguards to be protecting people's mental health if they're going to be engaging in these sorts of things. Since 2017, Instagram has actually been actively filtering potentially dangerous things as a form of censorship, and there's a huge debate about whether there should be censorship of any kind. But magic rituals like Safety Kitty alone, I don't think are enough, especially for the young, but that's another conversation for another day. To answer our original question then, is there something like a magic ritual in social media platforms? If we define magic as largely a matter of self-protection, and if we define ritual as this process of doing things that don't necessarily fit with a logical order or an explanatory framework that's obvious in any sense, then yeah, there does seem to be evidence for something like ritual magic in social media.